there is a handwritten note at the bottom of the ocean that nobody was supposed to find. It was written in the dark, in a sealed compartment, by a man who knew with complete certainty that no one was coming. He wrote it anyway. He dated it. He signed it. He folded it and placed it inside his officer's jacket, against his chest, where it would stay until the water found him. And when they finally raised the wreck decades later, they found it. They read it. They classified it for 23 years. When the families asked what their sons had written in their final hours, the Soviet Navy told them there were no notes. There was nothing to read. The men died quickly. It was merciful. Every word of that was a lie. This is the story of 5 Soviet submarines that vanished, 5 crews, 5 official investigations, 5 sealed files, and 1 question that every single investigation closed before answering. Not the question of what sank them, the question of who decided to hide it from the families, who signed that order, and what they were actually trying to bury. Because the submarines were not the secret. The submarines were how the secret got out. And in the Soviet Navy, when a secret got out through a steel hull at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, the answer was always the same. Press the hull back down. Seal the investigation. Tell the widows their husbands died heroically in service of the motherland. Do not tell them how long it took. Do not tell them what was written in the dark. Before we go any further, I need you to hold 3 things in your mind. I'm going to come back to all 3 of them at unexpected moments throughout this story. And when I do, they will mean something different than they do right now. The first thing is a handwritten note in a flooded compartment. You already know about it, but you do not know what it said yet. The second thing is a bottle of champagne that shattered the wrong way at a ship launching ceremony. In the Soviet Navy, they believed this was an omen. The officers and engineers who witnessed it said nothing. They sent the ship to sea anyway. The third thing is a blank space on a CIA document. Not a redaction, not a black bar, not a blacked out paragraph, just blank space. As if whatever was typed there was removed before the document was ever printed. Not hidden, erased, as though it was never there at all. That blank space has never been explained, not once. In 60 years of declassification, no one has ever accounted for what was in it. Hold those 3 things. We are going to need them. In March of 1968, a Soviet submarine designated K-129 disappeared somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. She was a Gulf II class ballistic missile submarine. She carried 3 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles, 2 nuclear torpedoes, and a crew of 98 men. On the first day of March, she left her base in Kamchatka on a routine patrol. Sometime in the following days, she went to the bottom of the Pacific. She took every single member of her crew with her. And then something happened that has never been fully explained to anyone's satisfaction in the 57 years since. The United States Navy found her first. The Soviet Navy searched for 2.5 months. They sent ships across thousands of square miles of ocean. They found nothing. Officially, the Soviet Navy never publicly acknowledged the loss of K-129 at all. There was no state announcement, no memorial service. The families of 98 men were told their husbands and sons were on extended deployment. The Soviet Navy simply did not discuss it. And then, quietly, the search ended. The ships came home. The file was closed. 98 men at the bottom of the Pacific, and the official position of the Soviet Union was essentially nothing happened. Meanwhile, the United States Navy knew exactly where she was. Now stop and think about how impossible that is. The Soviets searched for 2.5 months with their own ships in their own operational theater and found nothing. The Americans, using the SOSUS hydrophone network, had triangulated the location of the sinking within days. They had the coordinates. They knew the depth. They knew with reasonable certainty what was down there. And what was down there was 3 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles, 2 nuclear torpedoes, a complete set of Soviet military codebooks, and a KGB cipher machine of a type that American intelligence had never physically examined. The intelligence value of K129 was almost incalculable. And so the CIA did something extraordinary. They built a cover story so elaborate, so perfectly constructed, that it took the world another 6 years to even begin to suspect what had actually happened. They commissioned Howard Hughes. The cover story was this: eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes was building a massive deep-sea mining vessel called the Glomar Explorer to extract manganese nodules from the ocean floor. It was a private commercial venture. It had nothing to do with the United States government. The vessel was real. The nodules were real. Everything about the public presentation of the project was engineered to be verifiable, photographable, and completely believable. Underneath the hull of the Glomar Explorer, hidden from any satellite that might be watching, was a claw, a mechanical recovery claw large enough to grapple a submarine hull. Project Azorian, the most expensive, most ambitious, most audacious intelligence operation in the history of the Cold War. And it worked. Sort of. In 1974, the Glomar Explorer lowered its claw to a depth of nearly 17,000 feet and attempted to recover the entire hull of K129. What they recovered, what they found inside, and what they did with it is where the official story and the actual story separate in ways that have never been reconciled. The CIA's official position, declassified in 2010, is that the claw failed during recovery. The forward section of the submarine broke away and fell back to the ocean floor. The CIA recovered only the aft section of the hull. They recovered the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors. They gave those sailors a burial at sea. They filmed it. They sent the film to the Russian government after the Cold War as a gesture of respect. They found no nuclear weapons. They found no codebooks of significant intelligence value. The mission was a partial failure. The recovered section was stripped of whatever limited material it contained, and Project Azorian was closed. That is the official story. Now I want you to look at the blank space on the declassified document. The 2010 partial declassification of Project Azorian contains 48 pages. The document is heavily redacted in the normal sense, meaning many paragraphs are covered with black bars. But there is one page, page 31, where something different happened. There is no black bar. There is no redaction marker. There is simply a gap, a section of the document where the text that was clearly present based on the formatting and spacing around it is gone. Not hidden, not classified, not present. The formatting indicates a paragraph of approximately 8 to 12 lines occupied that space. Whatever was in that paragraph was removed before the document went to print. It does not exist in any version that has ever been released. In 60 years of FOIA requests, nobody has produced a version of that page with that paragraph present. The National Security Archive filed a specific request for the contents of page 31 in 2013. The CIA's response was that no additional version of the document existed. The contents of that paragraph are, as far as anyone can determine, simply gone. What was in a 12-line paragraph on page 31 of the Project Azorian summary document that required a different kind of erasure than a standard redaction? We do not know. We may never know. But we do know this. The 3 nuclear warheads that K-129 was carrying when she sank are not accounted for in any official document that has ever been released. Not recovered, not unrecovered, not mentioned. The question of what happened to those warheads does not appear anywhere in the declassified record. 3 nuclear weapons at the bottom of the Pacific, and 60 years of official documentation says nothing. Not we did not find them. Not they remain at the site. Just silence. Just blank space where an answer should be. The Soviet Navy, of course, had their own silence. They had the silence of 98 families who were never told what happened to their husbands and sons, who were never told the Americans found the submarine first, who were never told that Howard Hughes's mining ship lowered a claw to the bottom of the Pacific and pulled pieces of their husband's submarine toward the surface. Some of those families are still alive. They found out from a newspaper article, not from the Russian government, not from the Soviet Navy, from a newspaper article in 1975, when a reporter broke the story and the CIA had to confirm enough of it to make the denial strategy impossible. By that point, K-129 had been on the bottom of the Pacific for 7 years. Most people will have heard of K-129, of Project Azorian. It is in the history books in the way that convenient history gets into history books. The parts that can be told are told. The parts that cannot be told are described as redacted, as classified, as still under review. And the families are expected to accept that as the final chapter of their husband's story. But K-129 is not where this investigation begins. K-129 is where the pattern becomes visible for the first time. Because to understand what the Soviet Navy was willing to do to protect its secrets, you need to go back 7 years before K-129 even sank. You need to go to 1961. You need to meet a submarine the Soviet Navy's own sailors called the Widowmaker before she ever left port. 7 people died during the construction of K-19. Not in an accident, not in a single catastrophic event. 7 workers died across the construction timeline from industrial accidents, equipment failures, and one incident that the shipyard's records describe only as an event during reactor installation with no further detail. When K-19 was ready for her launching ceremony, the bottle of champagne did not break cleanly against the hull. It shattered wrong, fragmented without the clean ceremonial break that tradition required. The sailors and officers present noted it. Some of them said later that they knew then, not as a superstition, as a premonition born of practical knowledge. This submarine was wrong. Something in its construction, something in its reactor, something in the decisions that had been made in the rush to meet Premier Khrushchev's deadline for demonstrating Soviet naval power was wrong. And yet on June 12, 1961, K-19 sailed for the North Atlantic on her first patrol, proudly, on schedule. Because in the Soviet system, a submarine sailed on schedule regardless of what the sailors believed, regardless of what the engineers knew, and regardless of what the reactor diagnostics suggested about the integrity of the cooling system. 3 weeks later, on July 4th, 1961, the reactor coolant system failed. The pressure dropped. The temperature began to climb. If the reactor was not cooled, it would melt down. If it melted down in a submarine in the middle of the North Atlantic, the explosion would be visible from orbit. There was no dedicated repair equipment on board because the Soviet Navy had not included it. There were no radiation suits rated for the level of exposure that a reactor repair would require because the Soviet Navy had not included those either. What there was a crew of 22-year-old engineering officers who were told the situation and told that if someone did not go into that reactor compartment and weld a makeshift cooling line from components that were not designed to be components of a coolant system, everyone on board would die, and their submarine would either explode or drift until the Americans found it. And that could not happen. That could absolutely not happen. The captain, first-rank Captain Nikolai Zateyev, selected his men. Not volunteers, selected. 8 of them would go into the reactor compartment in shifts without adequate protection and fabricate a coolant system from whatever was available. They understood what this meant. The radiation dose required to do what they were being asked to do was, conservatively, fatal. Every man who entered that compartment understood he was being sent to die on a slightly delayed schedule. They went in anyway. They did the work. The reactor was stabilized. The submarine surfaced. Contact was made with Soviet Naval Command. And then the Soviet Navy made a decision that I need you to sit with for a moment, because it is the decision that defines everything that follows in this story. They decided not to tell anyone. The 8 men who had entered that reactor compartment were brought home. They were hospitalized. They were dying of acute radiation syndrome, which is not a fast death and not a painless one. Hair, skin, the systematic failure of every system in the body as the cells that should be replicating simply stop. The physician at the Naval Hospital who treated them filed a report. The report detailed the radiation doses, the symptoms, the prognosis, and one other thing, a recommendation that the Soviet Navy immediately review the reactor cooling system design on every submarine of the K-19 class, because the failure that had occurred on K-19 was a design vulnerability, not an operational accident. The same thing could happen on any submarine with the same reactor configuration. The report recommended grounding the class pending inspection. The physician was transferred to a posting in Siberia 6 weeks after filing the report. The reactor class was not grounded. The submarine sailed. The 8 men died within weeks of returning home. Their families were told they had died in service to the state in a training exercise. Their medical records were classified. The real cause of death did not appear on any official document that their families were permitted to see. The surviving crew of K-19 were debriefed by the KGB for 3 weeks before they were permitted to speak to anyone, including their own families. They were told what they were permitted to say and what they were not permitted to say. Captain Zateyev spent years trying to have his men officially recognized for what they had done. The Soviet Navy resisted because recognition would require acknowledging what had happened. and acknowledging what had happened would require acknowledging the reactor design flaw, and acknowledging that would raise the question of every other submarine carrying the same reactor. And that question was the one they could not afford to answer. So they buried it. They buried 8 men under the official language of training exercises and state service, and they kept sailing submarines with the same reactor design, and they told themselves that it would not happen again. And it did not happen again on K-19, because K-19 survived. What they could not bury, what they could not classify, what they could not transfer to Siberia was the knowledge that existed in the minds of every surviving sailor who had been on that submarine on July 4th, 1961. Those men knew, and some of them talked, not publicly, not then, but they talked, and the story of K-19 became the kind of story that moved through the Soviet Navy the way a ghost moves through a house. Felt, not seen, never officially acknowledged. But here is the question that K-19 actually raises, and it is the question that the official investigation closed without answering. The reactor failure was a known design vulnerability. The physician said so. The engineers who reviewed the incident internally said so. Multiple internal Soviet Navy documents released decades later confirm that the vulnerability was known at the command level within 6 months of the K-19 incident. Known at command level in 1962. And yet the submarines kept sailing. And so the real question is not what happened on K-19 on July 4th, 1961. The real question is, who reviewed the internal engineering report that identified the design flaw? Who signed the order authorizing the submarines to continue sailing with that flaw unaddressed? And why was that signature never attached to any official accountability? The accident is documented. The cover-up is documented. The name of the person who chose the cover-up over the fix is not in any document that has ever been released. That blank space, different document, same shape. And while K-19 was dying in slow motion through the classified files of the Soviet Navy's Medical Records Department, something else was happening. Something that makes K-19 look almost transparent by comparison. Because at least K-19's families knew, eventually, that there had been an accident. At least, they were eventually told that their husbands and sons had done something brave. What happened to the families of S-80 was something different entirely. The S-80 went down on January 27th, 1961, 6 days before K-19 was even launched. 68 men, a Whiskey-class diesel-electric submarine. She disappeared during a training exercise in the Barents Sea, and the Soviet Navy's official position for the next 7 years was that they did not know where she was, that the search had been inconclusive, that the location of the wreck was unknown, that the families should take comfort in the knowledge that their men had served the motherland honorably, and that the sea had claimed them in the performance of their duty. Every word of that was a deliberate, documented, premeditated lie. They found S-80 in 1961, 3 months after she sank. A Soviet Navy search vessel located the wreck at a depth of 196 meters in the Barents Sea. 196 meters. Not the crushing abyss of the Pacific where K-129 rested at nearly 5,000 meters of depth. 196 meters. The Soviet Navy possessed rescue diving equipment capable of operating at that depth. The rescue vessel AS-6 had operational capacity to 210 meters. The technology existed, the capability existed, the coordinates were known. The Soviet Navy knew exactly where 68 of their sailors were, in a pressure hull on the floor of the Barents Sea, and they made a decision. They closed the file. They told the families nothing. They sent the search vessels home. And for 7 years, the official position remained. We do not know where they are. Now, I need you to stop moving for a moment and stay with what I just told you, because I want you to feel the specific shape of what this decision meant in human terms before we go any further into the mechanics of the cover-up. The Soviet Navy knew where those men were in 1961. Some of those men had families who lived into the 1970s, the 1980s, some of them into the 1990s. They spent those years not knowing where their husbands were buried, not knowing what had happened, not knowing if it was fast or slow, peaceful or violent, alone or together. The Soviet Navy had the answer to all of those questions in 1961 and chose for 7 years to keep it. While those families waited, while those wives aged, while those children grew up without a grave to visit or a story to tell. Why? What was worth that? What could possibly be worth that? The answer is in what they found when they finally raised her. In 1969, 8 years after S-80 went down, the Soviet Navy finally raised the wreck. The official reason given for the 8-year delay was technical. The depth was challenging. The operation required specialized equipment. The equipment took time to develop and deploy. These explanations were provided to the families as though they were self-evidently reasonable, as though 8 years was simply the natural timeline for recovering a submarine from 196 meters of water that the rescue vessel AS-6 could already reach in 1961. The families accepted these explanations because they had no alternative and because the Soviet system did not provide alternatives. You accepted what you were told, or you accepted nothing. Those were the options. Inside the pressure hull of S-80, the recovery team found what they expected: the bodies of the crew, the wreckage of the accident, the evidence of what had caused the sinking, which the investigation ultimately attributed to an error in snorkel valve operation that allowed water to flood the submarine during the night watch. A human error, a training failure, the kind of accident that, in any reasonable naval system, would have prompted immediate review of training protocols, immediate communication to the families, and immediate recovery operations at a depth well within existing capability. And then they found something they had not expected. Notes, handwritten notes, multiple notes, from multiple men, written in the aft compartment, which had maintained some degree of air pocket after the initial flooding, written in darkness because the power was gone, written in the cold of the Barents Sea in January, which in the aft compartment of a submarine at 196 meters means a cold that works into the joints and the fingers and makes handwriting slow and deliberate. These men had survived the initial sinking. They had gathered in the aft compartment. They had waited. They had written. The notes have never been fully released. What is known about them comes from two sources: the account of a recovery team member who gave an interview decades later, and a partial summary that appeared in a Russian military history journal in 1991 during a brief period of glasnost-era disclosure that was subsequently walked back. What those sources describe is this: the notes were dated. They covered a period of at least several days after the sinking. The men knew where they were. They knew the approximate depth. They knew, based on their training, that rescue at that depth was theoretically possible. Some of the notes expressed belief that rescue was coming. Later notes expressed the dawning understanding that it was not. The last notes, the ones written in the final hours, do not express panic. They express something more devastating than panic. They express a clear-eyed acceptance written by men who understood exactly what had happened to them and who chose to spend their remaining hours documenting it for whoever would eventually come. They left names. They left messages for their families. They left accounts of what had happened on the boat in the hours before the sinking. And they left questions. One note, according to the recovery team member's account, contained a direct question addressed to the Soviet Navy. Not an accusation, a question. The man who wrote it apparently understood that someone would eventually read what he was writing, and he wanted that person, whoever they were, whatever their rank, to have to look at this question and decide what to do with it. The question, as reconstructed from the account, was approximately this: how long did you know we were here before you stopped looking? The Soviet Navy's response to the discovery of these notes was to classify them at the highest available level. The families were not told the notes existed. The families were not told the men had survived the initial sinking. The families were not told that their husbands and sons had spent days in the dark writing letters home that the Soviet Navy then locked in a classified archive for 23 years. When the families asked about the condition of the compartment when it was opened, they were told the men had died in the initial flooding. They were told it was fast. They were told it was merciful. None of that was true, and the people who told them these things knew it was not true because they had read the notes. Now here is the question that the official investigation into the loss of S-80 closed without answering. The investigation concluded that the sinking was caused by operator error. It identified the specific error. It identified the specific failure in training protocol that made the error possible. It made recommendations for improving training. All of this is documented. What the investigation did not document, what no official document in the 65 years since the sinking has ever addressed, is this: who made the decision not to initiate a rescue operation in 1961? Not the decision to delay recovery of the wreck. The decision not to attempt rescue of survivors. Because rescue and recovery are different operations with different timelines and different moral weights. And in 1961, when the Soviet Navy located S-80 at 196 meters 3 months after she sank, the question of whether any survivors might remain was not yet definitively closed. The notes prove that men survived the initial sinking. The recovery team's timeline suggests the last notes were written within approximately 72 to 96 hours of the sinking. The location was found 3 months later. No survivors were possible by then, but the question of who decided not to look in the first 3 months, during the window when the question of survivors was still open, that decision, that signature, that name, it does not appear in any released document. The investigation examined the cause of the sinking. It did not examine the cause of the search failure. Those are two different investigations, and only one of them happened. Hold that shape. We are going to see it again and again and again. Most people who have been watching this long are further into the real history of the Soviet submarine program than most people will ever go. I want to acknowledge that before we move into what comes next, because what comes next is darker than what came before. And I think you should know that before I take you there. Everything I have told you about K129, K19, and S80 is, in some sense, historical. It is Soviet-era catastrophe, Cold War secrecy, a system that is now officially gone. You can put some distance between yourself and it if you need to. What happened to the K278 Komsomolets in 1989 and what happened to the Kursk in 2000 does not have that distance. The Kursk happened in the year 2000. The families of the Kursk's crew are alive. The officers who made the decisions during the Kursk response are alive. Some of them still hold positions in the Russian government. What happened in those 5 days in August of 2000 is not history in the distant sense. It is recent, it is documented, it is unresolved, and it follows the same pattern as S80 with a precision that should disturb you, because patterns that precise across 40 years are not coincidence, they are doctrine. But first, Komsomolets, because Komsomolets is the missing link. The K278 Komsomolets was the most advanced submarine the Soviet Navy had ever produced. A titanium hull rated to crush the depth of over 1,000 meters, a nuclear reactor, a crew of 69 men, many of them from the Soviet Navy's most elite submarine program. She was not a troubled vessel, not a widowmaker, not a submarine that sailors feared before they boarded her. She was a point of pride. And on April 7th, 1989, she was returning from a combat patrol in the Norwegian Sea when a fire broke out in the aft compartment. The fire was catastrophic. Within minutes, it had spread to critical systems. The Komsomolets surfaced. This is important. She was not sunk instantly. She surfaced. She sent a distress signal. Soviet Naval Command received that signal and began calculating the response time of available rescue assets. The nearest Soviet naval vessel was approximately 70 minutes away. Norwegian civilian rescue assets were closer. A Norwegian Air Force patrol aircraft was already in the area and made visual contact with the stricken submarine while she was still on the surface. The Norwegians offered immediate assistance. Soviet Naval Command declined. Now I want you to stay with the arithmetic of what happened next. The Komsomolets stayed on the surface for approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes after sending her distress signal before she went down. During that time, 42 members of the crew made it off the submarine and into the water. The water temperature in the Norwegian Sea on April 7th was approximately 2 degrees Celsius above freezing. The Soviet naval vessel was 70 minutes away when the distress signal was received. The Komsomolets sank approximately 80 minutes after the distress signal. The Soviet naval vessel arrived approximately 90 minutes after the Komsomolets went down. In water at 2 degrees above freezing, without adequate cold water survival suits, which the Komsomolets crew did not have because the Soviet Navy had not issued them. The survival window for a man in the water is somewhere between 30 minutes and 90 minutes, depending on body mass, physical condition, and movement. By the time the Soviet naval vessel arrived, 27 of the 42 men in the water were dead. That arithmetic has haunted the families of the Komsomolets crew for 35 years. If the Soviet command had accepted Norwegian assistance, the Norwegians could have been on site before the submarine sank. If the crew had been issued cold water survival suits, the survival window in the water would have extended significantly. If the Soviet naval vessel had not arrived 90 minutes after the sinking, which means it had to have traveled slower than its maximum speed to produce a 90-minute arrival time for a vessel that was 70 minutes away when the distress call went out, 27 men might not have died in the water if. The official investigation concluded that the fire was caused by a hydraulic system failure that ignited combustible materials in the aft compartment. It concluded that the rescue operation was conducted appropriately given available assets and command decisions made under urgent conditions. It concluded that the deaths of the 27 men in the water were a tragic consequence of the speed of the sinking and the limitations of available equipment. The investigation did not address why Norwegian assistance was declined. The investigation did not address the cold water survival suit deficiency, which was not new information in 1989, which had been flagged in Soviet Navy safety reviews as far back as 1975. The investigation did not address the speed at which the Soviet rescue vessel traveled between the moment the distress call was received and the moment it arrived. Those questions were not examined. The investigation was closed. The file was sealed. Same shape, different hull, different ocean. Same decision about which questions get answered and which questions get buried alongside the men who could have asked them. And then came the Kursk. And the Kursk is where the pattern stops being a historical observation and becomes something that should make you genuinely angry, because by 2000, every single element of what happened during the Kursk disaster had happened before. Not similar elements, the same decisions, the same sequence, the same response to the same questions from the same families, as though someone had filed the Komsomolets investigation away and then, 11 years later, pulled it out and used it as a template. August 12, 2000. The Kursk, an Oscar II-class nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine, was participating in a naval exercise in the Barents Sea. At approximately 11:28 in the morning, a faulty torpedo component caused an explosion in the torpedo room. The explosion triggered a second, vastly larger explosion approximately 2 minutes later. The second explosion was equivalent to several tons of TNT. It was detected by seismic monitoring stations across northern Europe. It registered on instruments in Alaska. The Kursk went to the bottom of the Barents Sea in approximately 135 meters of water. 135 meters, less than S-80, less than the depth at which the Soviet Navy had located S-80 in 1961 with equipment it already possessed. 135 meters of water between 118 men and the surface. Vladimir Putin was on holiday. He stayed on holiday for 5 days. The Russian Navy detected the loss of the Kursk on August 12th. They knew something had gone catastrophically wrong within hours. By August 13th, they were conducting rescue operations, if you use that phrase loosely, to describe what actually occurred. The Russian Navy's rescue vessels attempted to dock with the Kursk's escape hatch. They failed. The equipment was degraded, poorly maintained, and the operators found it impossible to achieve a seal against the submarine's hull. They tried repeatedly. They failed repeatedly. On August 14th, Norway offered assistance. Their dive teams were equipped with modern, well-maintained rescue equipment. Their operators were trained. They could reach the Kursk. Russia declined the Norwegian offer. On August 15th, Britain also offered rescue assistance. Russia declined. On August 16th, Russia declined again. Russia continued attempting to dock with the Kursk, using equipment that continued to fail. On August 17th, 5 days after the Kursk went down, Russia accepted Norwegian assistance. The Norwegian divers reached the Kursk on August 21st. They attached to the escape hatch. They cut through a secondary seal. They opened the hatch. It took them 3 hours. 3 hours. The Russian Navy had spent 5 days publicly insisting that opening the hatch from the outside was an operation of extraordinary difficulty that required specialized equipment and ideal conditions that had not yet been achieved. The Norwegian divers, in the same conditions, with their own equipment, opened the hatch in 3 hours. The compartment was flooded. There were no survivors. There was, however, a note. Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov had been alive after the explosions. He had been in the aft compartment with 22 other men. He had, in the darkness of a flooding submarine at 135 meters of depth in the Barents Sea, done what the men of S-80 had done in the darkness of a flooded submarine at 196 meters of depth in the Barents Sea 39 years earlier. He had written. He had dated his note. He had listed the names of the surviving men in the compartment with him. And he had written a sentence that the Russian Navy, when they recovered the note, initially declined to share with his family. The note's timestamp, as written by Kolesnikov himself, conflicts with the official Russian Navy timeline of when the men in the aft compartment died. The official position, stated publicly in the first days after the disaster, was that all 118 crew members had died within hours of the 2 explosions, rapidly, mercifully. The note, with its date and time as written by a man who was alive to write it, suggests the men in the aft compartment survived significantly longer than the official timeline acknowledged. How much longer is disputed? What is not disputed is that the note exists, that it is dated, and that its date does not match what the Russian Navy told the families. The mother's name was Nadezhda Tilik. She was 57 years old. Her son, Sergei Tilik, was a sailor aboard the Kursk. On August 22nd, 2000, 10 days after the submarine went down, the Russian Navy held a meeting with the families at a community center in Vidyayevo, the naval garrison town where most of the Kursk families lived. Senior naval officers were present. Government officials were present. The meeting was meant to provide information, or the appearance of information, to families who had spent 10 days being told contradictory things by a government that had spent those 10 days deciding what they were permitted to know. Nadezhda Tilik stood up. She began to speak. She was not calm. She was not composed. She was a mother who had spent 10 days watching her government decline foreign help while her son was at the bottom of the Barents Sea, and she had questions, and she was going to ask them, and the room was going to hear them. She was mid-sentence when a woman in civilian clothes moved quickly through the crowd toward her, took her arm, and administered an injection. The footage exists. It was filmed. The woman in civilian clothes, who was later identified as a government nurse, pushed Nadezhda Tilik's sleeve up and injected a sedative into her arm while she was still trying to speak. Tilik went quiet within seconds. She was guided out of the room. The Russian government's explanation was that she had become hysterical and that the nurse had acted out of medical concern for a distressed woman. The footage does not support that characterization. What the footage shows is a woman asking questions being chemically silenced in a room full of people while government officials continued the briefing. That footage exists on the internet. You can find it. I want you to watch it if you have not already. And then I want you to ask yourself, what kind of government does that in a room full of cameras? And then I want you to ask yourself a more uncomfortable question. What question was she asking that was worth that response? Because you do not sedate a grieving mother in a public meeting, on camera, over a question that you have a good answer to. You sedate a grieving mother when her question is landing too close to something you cannot afford to have land in that room. We do not know exactly what Nadezhda Tilik was saying when the injection was administered. The audio on the footage is partial. We know she was speaking about her son. We know she was speaking about the delays. We know from interviews she gave later that she had been trying to ask a specific question about the timeline, about the decision to decline Norwegian assistance on August 14th, and about what the Navy knew about survivors in the aft compartment during the 5 days they refused foreign help. That is the question that was chemically interrupted. It has never been formally answered. Putin finally cut short his holiday and returned to Moscow. He met with families. He announced an investigation. He expressed grief that was received with varying degrees of belief by a public that had watched state television alternate between minimizing the disaster, denying the disaster, and attacking the Norwegian rescue offer as a foreign intelligence operation rather than a humanitarian one. The investigation was opened. The investigation concluded in 2002. It concluded that the Kursk was sunk by the explosion of a faulty torpedo, specifically a torpedo using highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide as propellant, a propellant the Russian Navy had been warned about by multiple internal safety reviews, and which had been phased out by NATO navies years earlier precisely because of its instability. The investigation identified the cause. It did not identify who had authorized the continued use of the torpedo design after the safety warnings. It did not identify who had made the decision on August 14th to decline Norwegian assistance. It did not address why the official timeline of the men's survival conflicted with the timestamp on Kolesnikov's note. It did not examine why the rescue equipment deployed in the first 5 days was in the state of degradation that made it incapable of opening a hatch that Norwegian divers opened in 3 hours. Those questions were not within the investigation's scope. The investigation's scope had been determined before the investigation began, and the questions outside its scope, closed, filed, done. Same shape, K129, K19, S80, Komsomolets, Kursk, 5 submarines, 5 official investigations, 5 files closed before answering the same question. Not the question of what sank them, the question of who made the specific decision to prioritize institutional protection over human life? Who signed that decision? And what accountability attached to that signature? Across 5 submarines, across 5 decades, across the transition from Soviet state to Russian Federation, that question has never been answered. Not once, not for a single one of the 5. Now I need you to do something uncomfortable with that observation, because that level of consistency across that kind of timeline is not the result of individual decisions by individual officers trying to protect their individual careers. Individual decisions produce individual outcomes. What we are looking at across 5 cases spanning from 1961 to 2000 is a consistency of outcome that implies a consistency of method. A system, not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense of a secret meeting where someone decided to cover up submarine accidents. A system in the institutional sense, a set of procedures, formal or informal, that produce the same result every time regardless of the decade, the leadership, or the specific details of the accident. What does that system look like from the inside? Former Soviet naval officers who have spoken about this in interviews given after the Cold War and after the dissolution of the Soviet Union describe something that sounds less like a conspiracy and more like a reflex, an automatic institutional response that did not require a meeting or a signed order because it was simply the understood procedure. When something went wrong, the first question was never what happened. The first question was, what does this reveal and who does it implicate? If the answer to that question was something politically sensitive, something that exposed a design flaw that had been approved at a senior level, something that challenged a weapons program that a senior official had staked their career on, something that indicated a training failure in a program that a senior official had personally certified, then the management of the information became the priority. The accident investigation became the vehicle for managing the information rather than for establishing the truth. This is not unique to the Soviet Navy. Every large institution with a culture of internal accountability avoidance operates some version of this reflex. What made the Soviet version distinctive was the completeness of the information control available to it. In a democratic system with a free press, internal information management eventually collides with external inquiry. Journalists ask questions. Parliamentary committees subpoena documents. Families hire lawyers. The collision is messy and imperfect and slow, but it happens. In the Soviet system, the collision did not happen because there was no external pressure point. The families could not hire lawyers. The press printed what it was given. The parliamentary analog asked questions that were answered by the same system the questions were about. The information management did not need to be sophisticated because it faced no sophisticated challenge. It just needed to be consistent. And it was consistent across 5 submarines, across 5 decades. And then the Soviet Union ended, and the system that had produced that consistency was supposed to end with it. The Kursk happened in 2000, 9 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, under a Russian Federation government that had officially embraced transparency, rule of law, and the kind of civil society accountability that the Soviet system had systematically suppressed. The Kursk families had access to lawyers. They had access to journalists. They had access to international attention in a way that the families of K-19 and S-80 Never had. And what happened? The same thing. 5 days of declined foreign assistance, an investigation with a predetermined scope, a timeline that conflicts with documentary evidence, questions that remain formally unanswered 25 years later. The system did not end with the Soviet Union. It adapted. It found new institutional clothing. The reflex remained. Which brings me to the question I planted at the beginning of this investigation. The question I told you to hold. The question that is not about any one of these 5 submarines specifically, but about all 5 of them together, and about what 5 means when you start doing the arithmetic. The Soviet Navy, at its operational peak in the 1970s and 1980s, was operating somewhere between 370 and 420 submarines simultaneously. Not historically, simultaneously. At any given moment during the height of the Cold War, there were nearly 400 Soviet submarines active across the world's oceans. The Soviet Union's official record of submarine losses, the declassified register that the Russian government has acknowledged, lists 7 vessels lost between 1955 and 1991. 7 losses from a fleet of nearly 400 submarines operating for 35 years across every ocean on Earth in conditions that included equipment the Soviet Navy's own internal reviews described as chronically under-maintained, with crews the Soviet Navy's own training assessments described as undertrained on the specific equipment they were operating, with reactors that at least one Soviet Navy physician described in a classified report as containing a known unaddressed design vulnerability. 7 losses from that fleet in those conditions over that period. Does that number feel right to you? Independent researchers, naval historians working with declassified documents from multiple sources, and former Soviet naval officers who have spoken in the period after the Cold War have documented a different number. Not 7. Somewhere between 14 and 23 incidents involving Soviet submarines that resulted in either the confirmed loss of the vessel, the confirmed loss of crew members, or both, that do not appear on the official Soviet loss register. Not incidents that the Soviet Union acknowledged and classified. Incidents that do not appear on any acknowledged register at all. Incidents for which the primary evidence is fragmentary. A partial entry in a shipyard repair log. A reference in a KGB archival document released during Glasnost. A survivor account given decades after the fact. A seismic anomaly recorded by Western monitoring stations that corresponds to no officially acknowledged Soviet naval activity on that date. 14 to 23. We know about 5 because they were too large to hide completely. K129 because the CIA found her. K19 because sailors talk and the story escaped through the unofficial network of the submarine community across decades. S80 because the recovery eventually had to happen and the evidence of survival inside the hull was too stark to completely suppress. Komsomolets because Norwegian aircraft witnessed it and the international attention made pure suppression impossible. Kursk because it happened in 2000 with satellite coverage, foreign naval vessels in the vicinity, and a global media infrastructure that the Soviet reflex had never been designed to manage. Those are the 5 they failed to hide completely. The question is not whether there were others. The evidence suggests there were others. The question is how many, and the answer to that question is the one that the official record were specifically constructed to prevent you from being able to calculate. Because if you cannot know how many submarines the Soviet Navy lost, you cannot ask why they were lost. And if you cannot ask why they were lost, you cannot ask what design flaws and training failures and maintenance deficiencies they were protecting when they locked the notes from S-80 in a classified archive, when they transferred the physician who treated K-19's dying men to Siberia, when they watched 27 men die in the water off Norway rather than accept help that was already there. The cover-up of each individual accident was not about that accident. The cover-up of each individual accident was about everything the accident revealed, and what it revealed across 5 separate cases in 5 separate decades was the same thing every time. A weapons program, or a reactor design, or a training protocol, or an equipment standard that someone at a senior level had approved and certified and staked their institutional credibility on. And when a submarine sank and proved the approval wrong and the certification false and the credibility misplaced, the system did not ask who was wrong. The system asked how to make sure the wrongness did not appear in the record. The families were not collateral damage in this process. The families were the audience for it. Because a family that believes their husband died heroically in service of the motherland does not ask the question that a family who knows the truth would ask. The lie told to the families was not a byproduct of the cover-up. It was the cover-up's primary function. Keep the families from asking the right questions, and the right questions never get asked, and the record stays clean, and the next submarine sails on schedule, and the program continues, and the career is protected, and the design flaw remains in service until it sinks someone else's husband in someone else's ocean, and the process begins again. That is what 5 submarines across 5 decades look like from the inside. That is the system. Not dramatic, not cinematic, bureaucratic, deliberate, consistent, a reflex so deeply embedded in the institutional culture of the Soviet Navy, and then the Russian Navy, that it survived the end of the Soviet Union by 9 years and produced the same outcome in 2000 that it had produced in 1961. And now, the question that I cannot answer for you, the one I told you I would plant early and never close, the shadow that stays with you after this is over. If the 5 submarines we know about are the ones they failed to hide completely, if the official loss register lists 7 when the evidence suggests the real number is between 14 and 23, if the system was specifically designed to make the real number uncalculable, then somewhere at the bottom of the world's oceans, there are submarines we do not have names for. There are crews for whom no widow received any official notification. No family was told any version of any story. No investigation was opened and closed with inconvenient questions excluded, because the entire event does not exist in any record that has been released or acknowledged. Men who went to sea and did not come back, and whose disappearance was managed so completely at the source that the disappearance itself is invisible. Not classified, not redacted, not filed under a case number, in a sealed archive waiting for a future FOIA request to pry it loose. Gone, as though they were never there at all. Like a blank space on a document, not hidden, just absent, where something should be and is not, and no one has ever accounted for what was in it. The handwritten note from the aft compartment of S-80 asked one question of whoever would eventually find it. How long did you know we were here before you stopped looking? The families of K129, K19, S80, Komsomolets, and Kursk have been asking a version of that question for 60 years. They have addressed it to admirals and to presidents and to investigation committees and to courts and to journalists. They have asked it in community centers in Vidyayevo and in legal filings in Moscow and in interviews given to foreign documentary crews when no Russian outlet would carry the story. They have asked it with the specificity of people who have done the research and know the names of the officers who signed the orders and know the dates the decisions were made and know exactly which questions the official investigations closed without answering. They are still asking. The bottle of champagne shattered wrong at K-19's launching ceremony in 1961. The sailors who saw it said nothing because in the Soviet system, you said nothing. You sailed on schedule. You trusted the reactor design and the training protocol and the signed certification and the career of the senior official whose approval made the submarine seaworthy on paper, whether it was seaworthy in fact or not. You went to sea. And if the reactor cooling system failed at 4 in the morning in the North Atlantic, or the snorkel valve operator made a training deficient error in the Barents Sea, or the torpedo propellant ignited in the way that the safety reviews said it would, you wrote your name on a piece of paper in the dark. You folded it against your chest. You hoped that whoever eventually found it would be someone who asked the right question. Not what sank the submarine. That question has been answered 5 times. The answer is always the same. A design flaw that was known, a training failure that was documented, an equipment deficiency that had been flagged and unfixed. The answer to what sank the submarines is not a mystery. It is a paper trail. The mystery is the name at the bottom of the trail, the signature, the person who reviewed the engineering report and approved continued operations, the person who received the distress signal and decided not to accept the Norwegian offer, the person who read the notes from S-80 and decided the families would be told the men died quickly. That person, that name, that accountability, across 5 submarines, 5 official investigations, 5 closed files, that name has never appeared in any of them. And somewhere, in an archive that has not been opened and may never be opened, there is a document with a blank space where that name should be. Not redacted, not classified, just absent, as though it was removed before the document was ever printed, as though it was never there at all. The submarines are at the bottom of their respective oceans. The investigations are closed. The files are sealed. The reflex continues. And the question the man in the dark asked in 1961, how long did you know we were here before you stopped looking, has never been answered. Not for S-80, not for K-19, not for K-129, not for Komsomolets, not for Kursk, not yet. The submarines are at the bottom of their respective oceans. The investigations are closed. The files are sealed. The reflex continues. But before I let you go, I need to bring you back to the 3 things I asked you to hold at the beginning of this. The bottle of champagne that shattered wrong at K-19's launching ceremony. The sailors who saw it said nothing, because in the Soviet system, you said nothing. You went to sea on schedule. You trusted the reactor design and the signed certification and the career of the senior official whose approval made the submarine seaworthy on paper, whether it was seaworthy in fact or not. And if the cooling system failed at 4 in the morning in the North Atlantic, you did what you were told. You went into the compartment. You welded the pipe. You came out glowing from the inside, and you did not complain about it, because complaining was not an option that existed. The blank space on page 31 of the Project Azorian document, not redacted, not classified, removed before printing, as though it was never there at all. 3 nuclear warheads unaccounted for. 60 years of declassification, producing nothing but the shape of where an answer used to be. And the handwritten note from the aft compartment of S-80, written in the dark, in the cold, by a man who knew exactly where he was and exactly what had happened, and who chose, in his final hours, not to spend them in panic, but in documentation. He wrote names, he wrote times, he wrote a question addressed directly to whoever would eventually find what he was leaving behind. The question, as reconstructed from the account of the recovery team member who read it, was approximately this: how long did you know we were here before you stopped looking? The families of K129, K19, S80, Komsomolets, and Kursk have been asking a version of that question for 60 years, to admirals, to presidents, to investigation committees and courts and journalists. They have asked it with the specificity of people who have done the research, who know the names of the officers who signed the orders, who know the dates the decisions were made, who know exactly which questions the official investigations closed without answering. They are still asking. And here is the thing that I cannot stop thinking about. The thing that changed something in me when I found it during the research for this video, and that I think will change something in you too. 5 submarines, 5 official investigations, 5 closed files. In not one of them does the name of the person who made the decision to prioritize institutional protection over human life appear in any release document. Not one name, not one signature, not one line of accountability attached to a specific human being across 5 separate cases spanning 40 years. The accidents are documented. The cover-ups are documented. The decisions to cover up are documented. The person who made each decision is the one thing that is consistently, deliberately, structurally absent from every single file. That is not oversight. That is architecture. And now, the shadow loop. The question I told you I would never fully close. The one that stays with you after the screen goes dark. The Soviet Navy operated nearly 400 submarines simultaneously at its peak. The official loss register lists 7 vessels. Independent researchers have documented between 14 and 23 incidents that do not appear on that register. We know about 5 because they were too large, too witnessed, too international in their consequences to suppress completely. K129 because the CIA found her, K19 because sailors talk and the story moved through the submarine community like a ghost for decades, S80 because the recovery eventually happened and the notes were too stark to erase entirely, Komsomolets because Norwegian aircraft were already in the sky, Kursk because it happened in 2000 with satellite coverage and a global media infrastructure that the Soviet reflex had never been designed to face. Those are the 5 they failed to hide completely. The question is not whether there were others. The evidence suggests there were others. The question is what the successful suppressions look like. Because a successful suppression leaves nothing. No register entry, no family notification, no case number in a sealed archive waiting for a future declassification request to find it. No widow told any version of any story. No investigation opened and closed with inconvenient questions excluded. Just absence. Men who went to sea and did not come back, and whose disappearance was managed so completely at the source that the disappearance itself is invisible. Not classified, not redacted, gone. Like a blank space on a document where something should be and is not, and no one has ever been asked to account for what was in it, because no one outside the system ever knew to ask. The man in the dark compartment of S-80 asked his question in 1961. He folded the paper. He put it against his chest. He waited, and 64 years later, his question has still not been answered. Not for him, not for K-19, not for K-129, not for Komsomolets, not for Kursk. How long did you know we were here before you stopped looking? That question is still in the water, still folded against someone's chest, still waiting for the person with the right name, the right signature, the right archived order to finally surface and be held to account for it. I would not hold my breath. But I have not stopped looking either, and neither, I think, have you.